Hello, YouTube. Today we're going to be addressing some of the claims that Grace Blakely makes during an interview. Let's get right into it.
Capitalism was something we settled on based on a number of different stories that I have in the book to illustrate the point. So the basic premise of this book is that capitalism is not, as we're often led to believe, a free market system. You know, we have this view of capitalism as something that's like nice, decentralized, democratic system where markets decide who gets what, right? And this was a really central part of the ideology that underpins this system and that underpinned the big transformation that we had in the 1980s towards a more, in inverted commas, free market system. The idea being that you had the state on the one side and the market on the other side. And if you had more market, that meant less state and vice versa. And this was all based on this, USSR versus US dynamic that underpinned the Cold War. So we have this idea that capitalism means markets. You have more state, that means less capitalism. Sorry, more state, less capitalism, more markets, more capitalism. And that isn't really how this system works. Contrary to this idea that you have a kind of democratic, free market, capitalist economy on the one side and a centralized, authoritarian, kind of socialist society on the other hand, capitalism is actually a highly centralized system that rests not just on markets, but also on centralized planning, basically, a kind of authoritarian, hierarchical, oligarchic system where a few people at the very top of society get to decide who gets what. And we're told that that's not how it works.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack right there. The first thing I want to address is the supposed move towards free markets in the 80s. You hear this a lot from leftists. Reagan, Thatcher came in, neoliberalism, austerity, privatization. But the reality is that Reagan oversaw massive government expansion. Government spending went way up under Reagan. He campaigned on eliminating the Department of Education, but he doubled its size. He campaigned on returning to a gold standard, but he didn't do that. As for deregulation, the only substantial deregulation that occurred under the Reagan administration was started by Jimmy Carter and is pretty widely accepted as a good thing by all sides of the political spectrum, like the deregulation of the airline industry that allowed for regional operators and low-cost competition in terms of airline flights. People say that Reagan cut taxes. That's not even really true because while there were some celebrated tax cuts, there was also bracket creep, and they instituted new taxes like Social Security, and they eliminated a lot of tax credits. So if you look at like total tax receipts, that didn't go down at all. Maybe in terms of like if you torture the data in terms of like GDP or whatever, then you could say maybe there was a slight decline, adjusted for inflation. But in terms of like gross tax receipts, that didn't go down. Government spending, which is the real measure, because if the government doesn't tax it, but they spend it and just create the money, that's no different really than taxing, except for who pays the bill. So it's a myth. It's a lie that Reagan was some sort of free market. I suppose you could argue that there was some sort of qualitative shift in government spending, that it went from helping people to the national security state. That's sort of emblematic of how the duopoly conspires against the American people, in that the left-leaning party will expand certain types of government programs, and then the right-leaning party will expand other types of government programs, but they're all sort of increasing the size of government and increasing the power of the state. But I think mostly the mistake that Grace Blakely is making here is she's confusing the rhetoric of the Reagan administration and its backers with the reality of the policies that were pursued. The second claim she makes is that there is no free market capitalism, that it's really a centralized system controlled by a few oligarchs. And it seems to me that this is a gross oversimplification, that simply gathering 300 years of capitalism and labeling them the system as if it was static and unchanged the entire time is a gross oversimplification. There was laissez-faire capitalism in America, basically from colonial times up until the 20th century. Certainly in England in the 19th century, there was laissez-faire, limited government capitalism, where basically, the free market was let to run wild, minimal regulation, minimal government intervention and state control. Now, it wasn't complete absence of government intervention and state control, and it seems weird to ascribe the action of government, the interventions in the economy by the government, especially from statists who advocate for this sort of intervention, and then ascribe it to capitalism, which is the private ownership of the means of production. It's the market economy. I mean, yeah, the government intervenes in the economy, but that's not something that advocates of free market want to happen. That's something that statists force to happen. But the reality is, there was free market capitalism, and then through the 20th century in America, you have the rise of interventionism, regulation, uh, uh, tax redistribution, welfarism, socialism, statism. So, as the power of ideas affected change throughout history, the system evolved from one that was free market, basically the sort of myth that she holds up, that was the case, and then it evolved and devolved and degraded into something else, which is the present system, which even still has large free market elements. It would be a mistake to equate this with central economic planning by any stretch. There are large free market elements in the modern American and Canadian economies, but you also have subsidies and distortions and taxation and regulation and crown corporations and all this other stuff.
On the other hand, so Lucas Aerospace was a big aviation company in the UK that was around in the 1970s. And it was about to go under. It was under threat from competition from abroad. And so the unionists at Lucas Aerospace went to the then Minister for Trade and Industry, Tony Benn, and they said, can you nationalize us? And Tony Benn said, no, the Labour government's in a bit of trouble. We can't nationalize the company. But why don't you guys go away? What we could do with Lucas Aerospace as to how we could save it. So the unionists went away, and at first they tried to consult a bunch of academic experts and they got like no replies. So eventually they come up with this radical idea of why don't we actually ask the workers who are doing this work how they think this company should be run. And they were a bit skeptical at first. They were like, we don't really know what we're going to get back. The response they got was astonishing. They had workers from across the corporation saying, firstly, we're producing weapons that are being used by authoritarian regimes all around the world. We don't want to do that anymore. We want to produce socially useful technologies. We want to produce kidney dialysis machines, wind turbines. And here are all the instructions and specifications that you will need to show how we can use the resources that we have now to transform this corporation into producing things that are completely different. Oh, and by the way, we think that this firm should be run completely differently as well. We don't need to be managed. We don't need this rigid hierarchy.
And then everyone clapped. There's only one little problem with this history of Lucas Aerospace, which is that the plan was never put into action. Like so many socialist pipe dreams, it was just an idea. In reality, Lucas Aerospace ended up being sold to an American corporation called Lucas, and the resulting company was called Lucas Verity. It was the merger of Lucas Aerospace and Verity, the Verity Corporation. Lucas Verity was then sold to TRW, which is an American company that produces satellites and defense stuff for the military industrial complex. TRW then sold the company to Delphi. It was then sold to the Northrop Grumman. And there was a whole lot of restructuring and reorganization. Different parts of the company were sold off. And it's a really interesting case study in how capitalism, the market economy, restructures factors of production in order to cope with changes in consumer demand. and also how capitalism works on a macro international level. You have to be really careful with taking what any Marxist or socialist says at face value, because very seldom do they tell the whole truth about anything. And for them, it's much more about a narrative than it is about the facts that actually happen. I mean, the way that Grace Blakely tells the story, it was like the whole structure of production was reorganized, and they went from being this big bad corporation to, they were fighting for human rights and equality. And in reality, it was just a plan put together by trade unions that went nowhere. They got some play in the press, and that was it. They never actually implemented this plan. The next thing I take issue with is how she paints capitalism as a system of coercive control and domination.
Massive layer of management because doing that kind of transition, forcing workers to do something that they don't think is right, and forcing them to do so simply in order to kind of maximize profits for those in the top, that requires hierarchy, domination, control, the exercise of authority. That's what makes capitalism work every day.
That's not how capitalism works. Nobody's forced to show up for work. You show up to work voluntarily because you want to get paid. The whole system is based upon an individual's consent, voluntary choice. It's she's she's just wrong. She's saying it's one thing when it's the complete opposite. Nobody's forced to do anything in a market economy. Force and coercion are the complete opposite of what capitalism is all about, which is individuals freely choosing to engage in mutually profitable exchanges with each other. So it's very important to watch the use of language here. When she says forced, what she really means is, like the alternatives would be bad, therefore you choose to work. And even from this perspective, capitalism is the best system because it minimizes those negative consequences. So if you're just on an island alone, you're still forced to work from that perspective. In that, if you don't work, you're just gonna die. You'll starve to death or die from exposure or thirst or whatever. So even man on an island alone is not uh, exempt from having to work for a living, basically. But the capitalist system is so productive that even a worker earning a very low wage, somebody earning, the bottom 1%, whatever, of workers in a capitalist economy, they still only have to trade a tiny portion of their day in labor to achieve these basic necessities: rent, food, just enough to get by. In fact, you don't even have to work at all. And maybe this is partly because of state largesse or the welfare state, but there's soup kitchens, there's shelters. So in a modern Western society, you really don't have to work at all to get your absolute basic needs met. And okay, maybe we're sort of blurring the lines here between capitalism and Western society, but strictly from the perspective of the market economy, let's say you're making $15 an hour. I mean, realistically, you only need a couple dollars worth of food in a day. Not that most people only spend that much, or I spend that much, but you can get by quite nicely, especially in the short term, on say some rice, some beans, and some offal like chicken hearts or whatever. Some cut of meat that's not in very high demand at all. They're basically giving it away. You can meet your basic nutritional needs on say $3. So that's not even what is that, like 12 minutes of labor at $15 an hour. Rent, okay, we have a bit of a housing crisis in Canada, but let's say you're renting a room for $600 a month. Okay, so that's, you're looking at 40 hours of work just to get a cheap rental, room rental. So not ideal, but again, you're still meeting your basic needs on not a huge investment of time if your needs are truly basic. I mean, realistically, you could even split a room, so 30, 300, $300. Not that I'm suggesting you live like that, but if you're looking at what your basic needs are, privacy is sort of a Western luxury, which we should have. It's great that our society has reached that point where we do get our own rooms and our own apartments and whatnot. But just from the perspective of your basic needs, privacy is a luxury in the sense of in the sense of having your own room. But yeah, my point is nobody's forced to do things under capitalism. People choose voluntarily to do things. That's the whole point. That's why capitalism is the greatest system, because it's voluntary, because it's based on a person's consent, because there is no coercion, nobody's forced to do anything. That's the whole point. All the other systems, they do force you to do things. You got to work, or they'll shoot you, or throw you in a gulag. I mean, even under socialism, you'd still have to work in order to get your basic needs met. So this is a very common technique leftists use, which is that they compare the real world to utopia. They say, "Oh, look, it's not utopia; it's horrible," which is just preposterous. All right, that's all I'm going to do now. So, peace out.